عليكم. بس بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين.
Hello, everybody. I invite ladies and gentlemen here to listen to the national anthem.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the merciful, the most merciful, and blessings be upon His messenger, Mr. Redatir, the President of the Council, National Economic, Social, and Environmental Council, and dear officials of the state, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the various ministerial cabinets, ladies and gentlemen, the directors and officials of the public economic institutions, ladies and gentlemen, the experts, dear professors and researchers, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, the representatives of the members of the media, honorable assistants. We are honored to present to this event organized by the Council, the National Economic, Social, and Environmental Council, and also that's in order to discuss a subject that is very important, not less important than the subjects that were tackled before.
And the role of board of directors in boosting the national economic, because we all believe that public companies are the locomotive for the national economy. And this is why it's really important for us to evoke this subject and to put it to debate, because the CNES is the favorable space to bring together all the players and actors to discuss such subjects and debate on them, and also to evaluate the Algerian experience and to work on it in the future. And hopefully the recommendations of this summit or this conference will be submitted to the government so that they are taken into consideration in taking the important decisions regarding the country. Ladies and gentlemen, before giving the floor to the president of the CNES to give his opening speech, I'd like to welcome warmly the students of the National School of Administration and also the Institute of customs officers and tariffs and fiscality, and also our friends from Tunisia that belong to this institute of EDF in Qli'a. So I welcome them in their second country and wish them a good stay. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give the floor now to the President of the Economic, Social and Environmental Council for his opening speech, and also to welcome the audience. Thank you. On the name of Allah, the Beneficent and Merciful, and peace and blessings be upon our Prophet, Mr. Abdulaziz Khalaf, the advisor to the President of the Republic for Finance and Economy, Mr. Tariq Tur, Mr. Sharbul Khlas, the CEO of Sonelgaz, ladies and gentlemen, the executives of the state, the representatives of public institutions and public companies, experts and researchers present here or online, ladies and gentlemen, the experts and researchers, and also the students that are present here. So the unions of employers and dear participants. So first of all, I'd like to thank the audience for responding to the invitation of the CNAS and participating in the proceedings of this summit that comes in the framework of the series of seminars devoted to some economic subjects that are of a paramount importance on the national and international level, especially in light of the changes brought by the new trends of the international scene that world is witnessing, first amongst which is the COVID-19, and which impacted the dynamic of world countries and also the economic enterprises, private or public. So this series of meetings is aimed at giving space to bring together all the players and actors of common subjects of interest, and which aims also to boost the economy towards a better future. And the organization of this kind of meetings, which brings together all the economic and social players, is of a great interest for the CNAS. As a reminder, so the Constitution in its Article 209 stipulates clearly that the CNAS is a frame to discussion, debate, and provision regarding social, economic, and environmental subjects and topics. And also Article 210, which stipulates that the CNAS is taken in charge the following tasks. First is to provide space for the civil society to discuss and debate on social and economic subjects. Second is to sustain the debate and discussions between or among the social and economic partners. Three, to improve the performance of the social and economic aspects, and also to provide recommendations to the government. And in the future, the CNAS will be enriched with the participation of civil society participants and also economic players and social players, so that it could become full and complemented as provided for by the program of the President of the Republic. And we'd like to thank the President of the Republic for the encouragement and the support that he provides the CNAS with regarding the activities, the discussions, and the studies, and all the subject matters that have been tackled and will be tackled in the near future. After 6 meetings or encounters that have been prepared over the last 2 months, especially devoted to the partnership between the public and private sectors, the waste management, the contracts of the state, joint ventures, and network industries. This subject matter, or this encounter, is tackling a subject matter which is really important and which is entitled the governance of public institutions and public companies, and also the role of board of directors in the improvement of the capacities of companies. It's undoubtful that the public companies and also the public institutions and also the board of directors play an important role in building a strong economy and diversified economy. Ladies and gentlemen, the modern aspect that the public and private companies are witnessing now is becoming a strong point that plays an important role in the companies and societies, and this encourages us and obliges us to improve our capacities and open the field for this kind of activity, especially in such sectors as the sectors which are controlled by the public institutions. So this is about the good governance within these companies and institutions, which is materialized by the organizational frame and also the provision of competencies that the companies need actually to improve their capacities and their performance on the field. So the management of these public institutions are a good model and pattern, and I think that this would be generalized on other types of companies, such as the commercial companies and also the APEC companies, and they need to have a board of directors because their board of directors play an important role in the modern Algeria, in the new Algeria, and also to take advantage and to benefit from their experience. One of the objectives that we have today is to announce that what happened before is over, because we need more than ever before to give a new impetus to our companies. So the small size companies are the generator or the liver of the economy, especially with the technology that is present, also with the market that is available, and also the products that are generated by those small sized companies. This leads us to say that evoking the role of the board of directors is a necessity that we have to take into consideration, especially on account of the way and means that the public companies are selecting and choosing those councils of directors. So we have to shed light on the aspects that are related to the good governance of public companies, and also the role that the board of directors have to play in improving or developing those companies and also the councils. So when we speak about social bodies, we mean all the aspects of those social bodies that exist within companies. And to enrich this subject, the CNAS has seen to it to involve several players and actors, even foreigners, for the first level to deliver speeches and also to deliver presentations revolving around this subject, so via video conference or in person. So I'd like to reiterate my thanks to all the participants for their presence, for their attendance, and I hope that all the conditions provided by the CNAS have been met and will be an element of success for this conference. So I'd like to reiterate my thanks also and my welcome to the students that are amongst us, especially the students that are coming from Tunisia and also the students of EDF in Qli'a and all the participants and presenters today. And I'd like to extend a special welcome and a warm welcome to our friends from the Employers Union and also the representatives of companies, of public companies, without forgetting to welcome the PhD students that are coming from the High School of Commerce and Trade in Qli'a. Being myself convinced that this is an investment that we are providing to the future of Algeria in discussing and debating on subjects that are of paramount importance to our country. So thank you very much all, and I declare the proceedings of this day open. Thank you.
شكرا.
Thank you very much to the chairman of the CNAS, the Economic, Social and Environmental Council, Professor Redatir, and I give the floor to the CEO of Senalgaz, who accompanies this meeting as a sponsor. So he will give a brief and succinct speech to the audience. On the name of Allah, the Beneficent and Merciful. So I will try to make my speech in French so that our friends that are following from the other side would be able to follow us for this subject that is very important. Mr. the Advisor of the President of the Republic, Mr. Said Khalaf, Mr. the President of the CNAS, Mr. the Minister, Mr. the President, Mr. Darkour, gentlemen, the executives of public companies or private companies, our friends from the employers' unions, the press and media, representatives, good morning. Dear students as well. Yeah, we have a broader panel today. I'm very happy to be here with you today and thank once again, because we can never thank the CNAS for this dynamic that is being held every week, devoted to a current subject matter that is dealt with. So we can never thank them enough. And which keep us busy this summer and create this synergy, and also meet several operators and exchange with them on several subjects of common interest, current and in the future. I'd like to thank also the organizers for having given me the opportunity to express myself on a subject that touches our mode of governance, to take stock of the situation, of the current situation, and also to predict the future and improve what has to be improved. and also the dynamic that we have to confront in the future. The company governance is an important challenge to avoid bad surprises, because it sometimes also put at risk the future of companies. So the problematic is even more important, because it's about the governance of public and private companies, and also the management of public funds. So the energy group that I am honored to preside and chair is, amongst other, like Sonatrach, for example, has a governance mode that has to cope with a management mode related to the current economy. There is another aspect where trade is prevailing. We have to operate in such a way that allows us to maintain ourselves as a state institution to ensure the development, the economic and social development. In other words, as a lever of the state, we are a vector of economic future, and we have to adapt to the vision of our country. On the other hand, we are an economic enterprise and commercial company, and this is the dilemma, whose aim is to generate wealth, to stay or to remain competitive, and to generate benefit, generate profit as well. And this is why we have to have a maneuver margin, and also a policy that is dictated by an entrepreneurship spirit. So we have to conjugate these two elements that could be paradoxal sometimes, which means that the interests, the logic, and the necessities of some have an impact on the results of others. So this difficulty is even more pronounced when the company ensures a public service, which is the case of Sonelgaz. It's not all. In addition to ensuring a mission of public service, so the company is a limited company, and the sector where we are operating is regulated. So we have to add to this an investment plan, an important investment plan to support the companies. So the problematic is even extended to the financing and funding modes of the state, which requires an anticipation because electricity is not storable, so it cannot be stored. And to better, adapt to the subject of today, I'm going to give you a summary of the company. So Sonelgaz is a limited company which is regulated by the Commission of Regulation by Law 0102 of February 562. So Sonelgaz has been transformed in a limited company by this law in 1984. So Sonatrach holds shares or participation by its subsidiaries company, and to exercise its influence, the state has put in place an institution that regulate the strategic orientation of Sonelgaz, and this is in line with the trade code and through the General Assembly of the company. So the assembly is made up of the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Justice, and representative of the Presidency of the Republic. However, Sonelgaz has the possibility to set up a board of directors, bringing together the representatives of 7 ministerial departments, and which is made up of representatives of workers, employers, organizations as well. So this examines, approves, and also approves the decisions taken by the board, by the company, in line with the regulations and laws in force. So the board of directors of Sonelgaz has extended powers to extensive powers attributed by or allocated by the state. We have set up specialized committees, consultative special committees, especially the audit committee, which is made up of experts that prepare decisions to the councils. We have a council of ethics as well. So this event coincides with the event that we held yesterday with our friends from OALC. We have also the auditing of processes and financing and internal regulations. We have also a nomination committee that is set up, which is in charge of nominating or appointing the high executives within Sonelgaz, and which tackles all the managers, middle managers, and line managers of the group. Since 2002, Sonelgaz has convened 133 times its board of directors and taken a great number of resolutions. So 630 resolutions that have been taken, and this is to show you how important the board of directors is with for Sonelgaz. So Sonelgaz has always provided the means to invest in its mobilizations. We have worked to stabilize our assets and also to respect our mission of public service. Now we are confronted with financial difficulties, but we can remedy those because we have a strategic plan by 2035, through which we ambition to reposition our activities and concentrate ourselves again on our core work. We work on sustainability, and we worked on our energy improvement. We are ambitioning actually to work on that on the international level as well. We hope to achieve significant improvements in Africa. So I limited myself to make this short presentation about the importance of governance for Sonelgaz. So I didn't dwell into the complications that are posing a difficulty for Sonelgaz and the management that we are adopting to improve the overall situation of the company. So I give now the opportunity to the experts that are numerous today, and economists as well, and managers that are present here with us to deal with or to examine this subject matter that I consider important, and I will be very careful and very careful to your presentations and your questions, and I will work hand in hand with you for the improvement of the governance to come up with a solid and competitive economic tissue of the country. So I thank you very much again, and I wish you full success in your proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Boulakharas, the CEO of Sonelgaz, for his speech. And this group remains one of the main public companies that we consider has a big weight. So now I invite Mr. Nasser Bouranan, the moderator of this morning session, who is a social economist, expert within the CNES, Secretary General of the International Forum for the Governance of Public Enterprises, and former official at the African Development Bank, and also a former research director at many African and European universities, and former official at the RDS. Welcome again, Dr. Nasser Bornan. Thank you for your collaboration, your availability. The floor is yours, Mr. Bornan. Good morning, everybody. Excuse me, I was in the room and I had the opportunity to listen with interest to all the speeches given and the framework given to this event. I had the pleasure to meet friends that I haven't seen for a long time. It's been more than 10 years that I haven't seen a friend here. So first of all, I would like to thank Mr. Thier for this opportunity. I would like to say that I fell into the issues of governance like by luck several years ago. So the administrators, the managers have to work on the technical profile, not on their skills. So I was at the time working in the sector of rural development. I think it's very important to speak about the profile of the technical managers. I've been working with the African Development Bank. I've developed the strategy of development of the strategy of governance in Africa. And we also put in place an ad hoc group to see the financing strategies and through time, we made a group of elders for public enterprises. Why public enterprises? First of all, because public enterprises, you know, all the waves of privatization have a high volume of international debt. And the public enterprises more than 30% of GDP. And despite all what have been conducted in the process of privatization, the public companies remained almost an unmovable basis in all states, including the liberal states of the OCDE. Despite all the regulations in place. And I'm happy that Mr. Hans be amongst the experts. And we have worked together. The OCDE has worked on the directives in 2015, and the oldest one were made in 2004. And it's very interesting on the basis of what the CEO of Sonelgas said, the accent was put, the focus was put on an essential point, which is the commerciality and the non-distortion or the absence of discrimination towards the private actors. These are the two main elements that led to the revision of the issue of public enterprises at the international level. Now today, after the financial crisis of 2008, especially with the pandemic of 2009, we notice that the scope has enlarged, has become even bigger. reforming partially or entirely some enterprises need additional resources in order to answer needs that are increasing. The situation has become even more complex. The situation has become even more complex with the pandemic, especially with these stories we hear of reorganization of work because we are progressively working, changing the work nature, doing remote work, and it's changing completely the administration's work. We are accelerating the fourth industrial revolution that is taking place. So that's at the international level. At the national level today, we feel the need to revitalize the economy, to dynamize the national economy. I prefer using this word. So concerning this subject, there are a lot of challenges, technical challenges. The CEO of Sonogas has talked about challenges, and he recalled that amongst these companies, the Administration Council is the place of crystallization of logics that are not necessarily converging, and the accent is essentially put on the issue of shareholders. Today, we went from shareholders problematic into the issue of those taking part, the parties at issue. We're talking also about the local communities as well. And the parties at issues sometimes overpass across the national level. So sometimes these companies need to sanction these private companies. So we're in the situation where the challenges have become more and more complex. So we have many parties at issue. They have the issue of clean energies, where there's really a need to answer to these concerns. So in Algeria, we need to take into consideration another dimension, which is achieving the objectives of development, the sustainable development goals adopted by the United Nations, and the companies needed to integrate them. So when talking about enterprises, here we're not just talking about industrial companies. The companies include all companies that have actions including the financial system. So the banks are a kind of particular animal, but there are regulations that are in place that need to be respected. That's to tell you the importance of this problematic. So today, it's important to make sure that we focus not on the relation state administration council, but on the functioning, the role of a particular organ or body, which is really a key body, which is the administration council. So speaking of that, I would like to go back to maybe 2-3 things that you may not know. We have the chance to have with us Mr. Hans. who is probably one of the gurus in terms of governance of public enterprises. So I think we need to get the best of him. So he has worked for a long time on the legal aspect. Mrs. Yakut Akrun, she will give us her highlights. And we'll have also the experience of EDF, the French company, with Dr. Pierre Bobby. And today we have the French agency managing participations. So we'll have numerous participations, and I call the panelists to focus on the key question of the role and functioning of administration councils. So without further delay, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Hans Christiansen.
With us, I'm sure that, you may remember our group when we were with YRK, Mike Gillibrand and the others, the elders, and you are still there. That's very nice of you, and to continue with this fight for improvement of corporate governance in SOEs. Thank you. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for CNES and my fellow distinguished panelists and ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pity that I cannot join you in Algeria today, but I'm very happy for this opportunity to say a few words about OECD and international best practices. I have a presentation, and I will try to share my screen. 1 second. One second. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Hello, can you?
It's okay, Mr. Hans.
I don't know, maybe CNES can put my presentation on. Okay, but while we're waiting, let me first say that by ways of introduction of myself, yes, my name is Hans Christiansen, and I am responsible for OECD's work on state-owned enterprises, SOEs. Now, among the various hats I'm wearing, I serve as the secretary to the OECD Working Party on State Ownership and Privatization Practices. I am, some of you may be acquainted with this, but otherwise it is the world's only standing body bringing together high-level representatives of those parts of government, be it then ownership agencies or, no, we are not quite there yet, the previous slide, please. Ownership agencies where they exist, or government ministers that have large portfolios of state-owned enterprises. This is unique in the sense that when the OECD speaks about good practices or less good practices in SOEs, it's really not just a handful of smart people in Paris expressing themselves. It's really a consensus view by our 38 member countries and another 10 observers in this working party who are who are expressing themselves. And their main means of expressing themselves is the OECD guidelines on corporate governance of state-owned enterprises, which you see presented on your screen in front of you. They are actually available in Arabic also, thanks to the collaboration of حوكمة Institute in Dubai. So thanks for that. Now, the OECD guidelines, briefly, are an OECD legal instrument, but they are also non-binding. So no government, no enterprise is in any given situation obliged to implement our guidelines. So how can I now square this circle by saying that it's a legal instrument but it's non-binding? Well, it's a legal instrument in the sense that any OECD country must formally associate themselves with the guidelines, and any newcomer to the organization must prove that they can credibly do so. So that's point one. And point two, they're not limited to OECD member countries. No, please. A growing number of non-member countries actually also undergo reviews under this instrument, and some of them apply to be recognized as an adherent to the instrument, a non-member adherent to the instrument. And I'm mentioning this, of course, because the option would also be open to Algeria should your country want to bolster your SOE governance by means of cooperation with the OECD and implementation of some parts of OECD's recommendations. Finally, this is not a corporate instrument. The recommendations and the guidelines are very much addressed to policymakers and public officials. It is about how they organize their oversight and the stewardship of state-owned enterprises. This is the core of this instrument. So, next slide, please. Yes. So, what is the content of the instrument? Well, there are 7 chapters, and briefly, we start by having clear roles and objectives. The OECD consensus says that the state as an owner should clarify for each SOE what are the rationales for state ownership. It needs to make its head clear about why does the state need to own this company. And once that has been clarified, it should then flesh out this rationale into some implementable financial and non-financial objectives for each company. Now, I'm stressing the point non-financial, which the president of Sonorgas also covered, because the OECD is not saying that SOE should have purely financial objectives. It's perfectly legitimate for them to pursue public policy objectives. Presumably, that's why they need to remain state-owned in the first place. But we're saying that there should be absolute clarity about what it is that the enterprises are expected to be doing in financial and non-financial terms. Unless this is clearly specified, there cannot be any accountability. Secondly, there's an issue of organizing a strong state ownership function. I'll come to that in a second, so let's leave that for now. Point 3, there is the issue of having a rules-based environment. That means the rule of law should really apply where the SOEs operate in competition with other companies. It's important that they are neither advantaged nor disadvantaged because of their ownership. And that's, of course, especially a concern in a country like Algeria, where we heard that SOEs account for about a third of the GDP, and they're probably about half of the corporate landscape. So that, and point 4 is an equitable treatment of shareholders. A growing number of OECD countries list minority stakes in SOEs and stock markets. And that's a good practice that the OECD recommends, because stock market listing makes an SOE subject to some governance requirements, some disclosure requirements that really help improving the functioning of those companies. But in this process, it is important that the state understands that it cannot continue treating a listed SOE as if there are no minority shareholders. Then there's the issue of stakeholder relationships. Of course, any company knows that it's important to have good relations with stakeholders, creditors, employees, affected communities. But there is an additional twist when you're talking about state-owned enterprises, because our member governments and other governments have taken out some public commitments to corporate and social responsibility. And that is really nonsensical unless the state applies these high-minded principles to the end its own enterprises. And then there is the issue of transparency and disclosure. And again, everybody knows that transparency and disclosure is important in the corporate sector. But again, here we have an added twist, and that is that it applies not just to the companies, but also to the state. The state should publish annually what we call an aggregate report, so that any member of the public and of parliament can see on paper what is the state's portfolio of enterprises, how do they operate in financial and non-financial terms. And finally, there is the issue of boards of directors, and that's the main topic of today's discussion. And I will also revert to that in a few minutes. So next slide, please. Yes, on this all-important question of how does the state act as an enterprise owner. One of the key recommendations is that the government should develop what we call an ownership policy, which specifies, as I said, the rationales for ownership and lays out in some detail how the state exercises its ownership rights. And that's crucially important because unless the government has sort of committed itself to acting as an active and engaged enterprise owners in a certain way, there cannot really be any monitoring, any accountability, any basically reform is almost nonsensical in the absence of such an overall commitment. And this is a very tricky issue, but the OECD recommends that the exercise of ownership rights should be centralized in a single state ownership body, or if this is not possible, I mean, if you still have SOEs out with various line ministries, then at the very least there should be a coordination unit at the central level that sort of sets out some general rules for how the ministries can exercise their powers and monitors how well they're being implemented. And the reason we say this is these enterprises belong to well, not even to the government, they belong to the shareholders and the taxpayers, the general public, but they are overseen by the government on a whole of government basis. They should never become a place for individual ministers and individual ministers. And finally, we're saying that the government should allow SOEs a full operational autonomy. That's also important. Of course, there can be too little government control. Then SOEs drift away and do no matter what. And so that's why we are saying that there should be a strong central state ownership. But it is equally important that these SOEs have sufficient autonomy to resist state interventions in their day-to-day operations, because if the government wants to maintain absolute control over public institutions, then they should be government agencies. They should not be companies. And I can mention in this context that this is a little bit outside today's topic, but we have a more recent instrument, which is our anti-corruption and integrity guidelines for SOEs. And when it comes to corruption and other illicit practices, some of the worst cases always occur when top government officials pretend that SOEs are autonomous and what goes on out there is really none of the government's business, whereas in fact there's a lot of hidden influence. That's the worst of all worlds. So next slide, please. So if I summarize the OECD thinking about this, it is really the OECD model is really about a vertical separation of responsibilities. On the top, you have the whole of government, which sets an ownership policy and coordinates any disagreement between ministers at cabinet level. And then you have an ownership unit. It can be a state ownership agency, a holding company, or indeed it can be individual ministers, but which must define objectives, financial and non-financial objectives for individual employees and monitor their performance. Inside the SOE itself, you have the board of directors, and now we are coming to it. And the board of directors has it as its key responsibilities to develop, in some cases, or in most cases, perhaps approve corporate strategies developed by the management, and then monitor management in its implementation of those strategies. And then at the lowest level, you have the corporate management, which then gets on with running the company. And outside of this vertical structure, you then have independent regulators, competition agencies, sector regulators, which are empowered to intervene on, not all 4 levels, but the lower levels of this vertical separation. And this is not just an academic exercise. I mean, some of the worst governance issues have occurred where decisions are made at the wrong level, when decisions that should be corporate decisions are made at the political levels, or when boards of directors are not empowered to do their job. And boards of directors are crucial in this. And in many countries, they're the weakest link. I mean, you have professional politicians and you have professional management in the SOEs. But if you have a weak board of directors, then this separation of roles begins to crumble. So I would like to go to the next slide. It's a bit difficult to read, but this is then the chapter about board nomination, about the role of board. I hear an echo. Okay. There are basically 3 main issues. Point 1 is to ensure that the state follows good practices in identifying, nominating, and appointing board members. The second is ensuring that the board is empowered by law and in practice to play the role assigned to it as the strategic oversight of the company. And the third is to make sure that you have board members that are actually autonomous enough and qualified enough to fulfill the role that is assigned to them. And I should stress just a couple of OECD recommendations. One is that the boards of directors should be composed so that they can exercise professional, objective, and independent judgment. Now, I stress the word independent judgment because this is an issue that comes up again and again and again when the OECD works with individual countries. A lot of them still have ministers or vice ministers serving in the boards of directors of state-owned enterprises. This is not a recommended OECD practice. And the reason is, I mean, we're saying, okay, that they should be capable of independent judgment, but the minister cannot be independent from himself. It is nonsensical. Sorry, I no longer see my slides. Are you bringing it back on? What? Okay, well, there is another key recommendation, and that is that SOE board should carry out the function, as I said, of setting strategy and supervising management. And for that to happen, it is the boards of directors, not the minister, but the boards of directors who should have the powers to hire and fire the chief executive officer. Because if that chief executive officer knows that he or she owe their job to the prime minister or the president of the country, then you have basically emasculated the boards of directors. They cannot influence and monitor management like they're supposed to do. And then finally, there are a lot of recommendations about the way the board should go about doing their job, but I'll leave that for now, and we can go on to the next slide. It is, of course, very good to develop good practices, but one should also monitor whether they are being implemented, and the OECD did that last year. Well, for the last 2 years, basically, doing some reviews of where have there been progress and what is the state of affair in various member countries. And now, I should say one thing about further thing about the guidelines, and that is that if you look at them and think about implementing them in Algeria, you will probably get depressed, because they are set at an extremely high level of aspiration, and I don't think that any OECD member country has fully implemented them either. The purpose of this is that they should serve as a roadmap for continuous reform of the SOE sector. And I'm glad to say that our study showed that that is indeed what has happened. Almost any national change for the last 5 years has taken countries closer to the guidelines. Now, specifically in the area of board practices, which is an area where we have seen significant progress in our member countries. Out of the 31 countries we reviewed, we had a large number who reported progress in assigning greater and more explicit roles to the boards of directors. Plenty of countries have improved the composition of the board of directors, and there has also been a movement in this area of professionalizing boards of directors, among other things, by adding board committees dealing with auditing, dealing with risk, dealing with ethics, assisting and strengthening the board's work in these areas. But if I just take one step back and talk about sort of the gist of recent change, there really are two main trends. One is to assign a more strategic role to boards of directors, moving them closer to the practices in listed companies, moving from a world where the board of directors is seen as an administrative cost and carrying out a limited supervisory function, to a world where they are integral to the formulation and monitoring of corporate strategies. And unsurprisingly, hand in hand with this development has gone a development where boards tend to become more and more professional and more independent. Fewer civil servants, more professional board members, including from the private sector. Next slide, please. We have, yeah, okay, fine. This basically covers what I said before, but I can add a couple of small points. And, in addition to what I said, further strengthening has been going on in a number of government ministers, state ownership functions to establish qualification criteria, establishing nomination committees to make sure that there's an organized procedure for identifying board members rather than just leaving it at the discretion of the minister. And some rules have been established for remuneration, not just of boards, but also CEOs. That's both good and bad. It's good to have transparency in this area, but in fairness, a number of our member countries have established ceilings on remuneration that are so tight that it's difficult to recruit competent persons to the management and the boards. That's, of course, not a good practice. It is what it is. And finally, there's been a continued and stronger emphasis on gender equality and other equality on SOE boards of directors. And I know, of course, that a lot of people would say that this ethnical equality and gender equality is sort of a bit of a feel-good kind of a political correctness thing, but it is actually more than that, because if the board is supposed not just to be a box-ticking board, but to actually guide strategies, then you need diversities, you need different perspectives. I mean, some of the worst board practices in the private sector, I mean, we haven't studied this in the state-owned sector, but in the private sector, some of the worst board failures came when the board members were all males, all the same age, had all gone to the same schools and played golf in the same club. It doesn't work. I mean, then you don't have the diversity of thinking that makes for a good board. Next slide, please. No, the last one, please. Next one. Just a few practices, the national practices. I'm not calling them good practices, but I'm listing them because 3 of the 4 were actually countries that did SOE reviews with the OECD and upgraded their practices in the context of those reviews. Costa Rica, most recently, kind of set out presidential decrees to define better the responsibilities and the eligibility criteria for board members, and put in place training programs. Latvia, earlier, at the OECD's suggestion, adopted a new law on governance of the shares in SOEs, and they also established procedures for nomination of the members of the board. And Estonia established such a nomination committee. We keep coming back to this nomination committee to professionalize and depoliticize the choices of board members. And just in case that someone thinks that this is just a nice piece of paper, I mean, actually, we have monitored Estonia, and since they established this nomination committee, the number of private sector independent board members in their SOEs rose from 20% of the board members to 65% of the board members. So the movement is clear, and the movement is in one direction, but of course, a lot remains to be done, even in OECD's own member countries. And so I'll leave it at that, Ms. Moderator, and I look forward to taking some questions from the floor.
Thank you, Hans. I mean, I know it was not an easy task to go through all this and to be comprehensive, but I mean, you touched the critical points for us. Thank you very much for your contribution.
I think that the discussion will be interesting because I have noted several points during the discussion, especially from an Algerian point of view. So I have 2 or 3 points that I would like to bring to your attention. We will come back to those. First, it's a problem of transparency and disclosure. When you look at the website of public enterprises or companies, be they financial or non-financial, so rare those who are updated or give information, there is a serious problem relating to transparency that we have to take seriously into consideration, because we don't make the difference, or we don't do what is done in several African countries. So I open a bracket because we should look at what is being performed in African countries in terms of company governors, also in Asian countries such as India, China, and Japan, and also Latin American countries and Middle East countries. We will have the opportunity to go back to that, to draw lessons from those points. The second point that drew my attention is the appointment of the members of the board of directors. I think that it's a pivotal point that we should focus on. It's split into two aspects. The first aspect is about the choice of people. The human element is really decisive. And the second element is the qualification of the persons or people in terms of company governance. We tend to forget that when we are in a company and that we have been appointed by a ministry, so we're not representing the ministry within the board of directors. Our main objective is to defend and protect the interests of the company itself. It's a big point that should be solved through training. I'm talking about that out of my own experience because I've been a director in a company, a multinational company, and I learned the lesson. And the third point that seems to me of a paramount importance is the delineation of the decision making. So it's unacceptable that a member of the executive board substitutes to a member of the board of directors in the dismissal, for example, of a CEO of a company or a member of the board of directors. If we would like to give a bad signal to our partners, we go in this direction. In this direction. So each one has to assume their own responsibilities and not interfere in the responsibilities and prerogatives of other people. I think that to be fair to the OCDE, Hans hasn't mentioned that. OCDE organizes regularly regional roundtables to discuss the problem related to company governance, and unfortunately the Algerians are not involved or included in these roundtables. I think that Hans evoked this problem several times, and I think that the Algerian authorities have the responsibility to remedy this issue. Now I invite Mrs. Akolun to make her presentation and brings us back to the national arena after this international presentation made by our colleague from abroad. Thank you, Mr. the Chair. So, moderator, so we're not going to open a debate on what a moderator is. So I'm going to be quick because I have another video conference because I committed to come in and making a presentation here. So thank you, Mr. Tier, the chairman of the CNES, to trust me and invite me to this conference. My subject is about public companies governance, and the role of board of directors is the subject matter itself of this seminar. So, taking into account the international dimension of this seminar, which brings together different legal cultures, so I deemed necessary to make a stop and to make a semantic observation about this subject of today, which is revolving around the role of board of directors in the company's management or governors. So, what do we mean by EPE or small size companies? So if it is important for, or if it is clear for some of us, so I think that it's less clear than for the other people who are following via video conference because they're coming from different cultures. So the explanation, the semantic explanation seems to me very interesting and important on the one hand, and on the other, I have always thought about historical approach of national or public company. So what is it today and what it was yesterday? What motivated, what guided the evolution of the various legal frame or legal frames that the companies have gone through? So I will go into the core of the subject afterwards, which is about determining the role of the council, the board of directors as a collegial body, but the role of the director as a member of this body or this organ, this collegial organ, to emphasize the obligations and liabilities on the penal and civil level. So we have to be aware that when we hold a meeting of the board of directors, we're not here to spend time or to do nothing, but we have to be aware of what we are here for. So to implement, to achieve efficiently and in a relevant way. So the responsibility and the role of the director. So let's start with the beginning, the definition of public companies. What is the definition of a public company? Here in the Algerian regulation. So we have two forms of companies here. We have EPIC company because it has a profit generating mission. So it's called public company. So EPIC is split into two words. So EP, which is établissement public or public company, and C, which is commercial, or EC, which is industrial and commercial. And the company has the objective of generating profit with their own company, their own products. So I'm not going to dwell into EPICs because it's not the subject of our meeting today, but I speak about the public company. So the concept was brought by in 88 by Law 01, which defines, and you tend to forget this, and they always tell me that you are mistaken when you say this. When you say this, it's defined as a socialist company held 100% by the state or by the local collectivities or communities, such as the wilaya or the municipality. This definition reminds us the governance pattern that I'm going to talk about in a while. So the socialist management of companies, this definition will be quickly abandoned to pave the way for the opening of the capital of public companies to private sector as part of privatization operations, because since 1995, the social shares of the companies are not going to be held 100% by the state. But they should hold, or the state hold, 51% of the shares. Another novelty in comparison to the new paradigm is that the public institution is not governed by socialist management model and be governed by the Commerce Code, which explains the holding of a board of directors. The definition of 2001 is still in force. This is in relation with public company. So it's an approach, a historical approach. It's a look back on what the management of a public company used to be before. Before the reform of 1988, as I mentioned it earlier, so the state companies, the public sector, was governed or was managed and governed by a particular management pattern, which is the socialist model, which was the epicenter of the decision making represented by the workers, because the workers played an important role on the managing director, who was the second control point of the public companies. So it was about developing a culture that makes of a worker an opponent actually of the board of directors, because 2 seats are reserved to the board of directors, to the workers, for companies that have more than 150 employees. The governors with an epicenter as the Assembly of Workers was ensured by a council of directors headed by the Director General. And you have to pay attention to what I am going to say. A Director General that acts under the authority of the ministry and also submitted to the ministry in their decision, because the public companies was the economic fist of the state, which had the responsibility to develop economy at the service of the citizens. So the Algerian state was the state of all the workers, and we have still the stigmas. After the development of this system in the 90s, with the Constitution of 1989, with a very weak trend, so this governance pattern was abandoned, but the public company is still seeking its management pattern or mode, which has difficulties in stabilizing, as I'm going to demonstrate in a while and very quickly. So governance of public companies have, or was in 1988, merchant public service, even though the word didn't exist then, because it was adopted in 1995. So we were talking about EPE. So the system lasted 6 years, and in 1995, so the shareholding system was removed to be replaced by another mode which had an impact on the public sector. Here, 6 years later, we abandoned this system following a diagnosis, between brackets, I don't know whether, or a diagnosis that wasn't satisfactory. So we abandoned the system of groups, and we said to ourselves, let's try the companies of management of shareholders per an ordinance that was issued. And in 2014, we abandoned SGP to substitute them by groups. So which means the headquarters that will manage a company portfolio that will be defined by or through parameters or others. And in 2014, as I said before, we come back to the classical concept of group with an inappropriate classification, because the group, as everybody knows, is a set of companies headed by the headquarters. So here, in this context, the headquarters is called the group. And a bit later, we came back to our logics that explain the question mark in 2001, which is the holding, which means companies, portfolio of companies, or a series of companies that manage a portfolio of subsidiaries. So this is the history of public companies. And this is how its governance, or their governance, is ensured. So governance is something, but good governance is another thing, which is completely better. So Algeria adhered to this dynamic of implementing the principles of good governance in the OCDE.
L'OCDE,
which defined two codes, one for public company and one for the private company, and the other one for the public company, from which the reformers, so Algeria adhered since 2000 in this dynamic, because there is a national action program in terms of governance that has been defined as part of the African mechanism of peer evaluation, NIPAD, and it includes the national governance and the governance of public companies, and brings together all the actors and players to develop codes of good governance. It's done for private companies because the FCE, in association with the think tank and the Association of Beverages Producers, they put in 2009 a good or a code of governance for medium and for small and medium-sized companies. I think that there are representatives of the Ministry of Industry, which initiated in 2016 a committee to elaborate or develop a code of governance for public companies. So we should not forget that questions related to ethics are now an epicenter. So as mentioned by the CEO of Sonelgaz, Sonatrach has also, or is also endowed with, an ethics committee, which is really basic and important, because ethics, like good governance, is a sign of good governance, good management, because many companies faded away on account of the lack of these two elements. But we have to admit that, unfortunately, reality is far from what it should be. And this is why we should do things in a way that allows us to limit this kind of deviation and also the human weaknesses, because I say it all the time, the biggest risk within organizations, be they economic or others, is the human risk. It's not the company that does mistakes, but humans do. So the quality of the human resources is at the center of the success of those companies, because it's really important, because the risk emanates from them. The law 0106 relating to the prevention and the fight against corruption, that put at the center of the mechanism the directors of the company, the CEOs, because they are defined as public agents and call for the respect of ethics and the implementation of a good governance, of a code of governance. This reminds us allows us to have a picture, a clear picture of what should be done in the future. So the commanding approach, the managerial approach, and everything resides in the current affairs. The Algerian commerce or trade law, and I'm going to display the heavy legal mechanism that govern our companies. So the Algerian law that governs actually the public companies offers to the businessman two types of management and governance. The first of which is called is unique. Is a unique French system which relies on one board of directors, and we have the second, which is the German dual system, which relies on a board of directors and also the council and control system. So this is the legal offer that has an impact on the reality of the Algerian public companies. A short answer is that the Algerian companies stick to the classical mode, which is the French mode, and don't want to adhere to the German mode. So it was practiced or implemented in 1995 because the public groups were submitted to the dual method. They had control councils and also board of directors, and a second time in 2001 with an ambiguous approach. We had, as per a decree, a unique decree providing for the organization of EPE, we had a board, but without a council of control, because we cannot conceive a management body without being accompanied by a control body or a control council. So we have a unique form with a particular or a peculiar lack, which is the body that controls the executive. You say the General Assembly, of course, but it convenes its meetings very rarely. So this is a type of public companies without any control. And this explains the lack of their performance. The system was abandoned, and the authorities went back to the board of directors, the bodies of management, and the control of management. So the organs or the bodies are the CEO and the council of the board of directors. So I'm not going to disturb you with a list that frame the aspects of a public company. So they are in the slide, on the slide. You can have a look at them. So there is a message out of this. There is not a legal ambiguity, because we have a non-clarity of the legal system in Algeria. I'm not going to dwell into this because I didn't calculate the time of my intervention, but I hope that I'm still within the frame time frame that was granted to me. And I'm going to speak. If we look at the laws that revolve around and frame the governance of public companies, a text that hasn't been mentioned sufficiently is the decisions of the CPE, the body of the participation of the state, and which manages the merchant public market, and which defined also the management mode. So for the CPE, so the board of directors should be the pivotal point of the management of public companies, but not any CPE, or not any board of directors. A board of directors whose composition or formation should be thoroughly thought of, and also involving people that are accountable for their actions, people that are accountable for what they did. But how? So we're going to go a little bit faster. So the state, which is a shareholder and that expresses itself through the CPE, and also the state has the right to require from its companies, of which it has the shares, it has the right to require from those companies performance. It has the right to do this, but it doesn't have the right to interfere in the day-to-day management of those enterprises. It's a balance between what the OECD calls an excessive intervention of the state, or a passive intervention of the state. So it's just a balance between the two extreme points, which are harmful. The first one is harmful because the state loses its control on the companies, and the second is also harmful because a lot of intervention in the management of the enterprise would jeopardize this management, because they don't dare take decision, they don't dare take initiatives because they're afraid of the Management Act. So I prefer not to do anything. I prefer not to displease instead of standing before a judge. And unconsciously, so there is the ghost of the act of management that haunts the spirit of those people. So the Management Act is not an offense, and we should not depenalize it because it has never been an offense. It has never been a crime. So we have to change its wording, and call it responsibility or management responsibility. There is another point which is about the involvement as well. So this is what makes, or this is how we can explain that the public companies doesn't know enough performance and doesn't respond. So I'm not the advocate of nobody. I'm just reading the reality to you. And this is what explains the merchant public sector doesn't meet the expectations of the state that has a lot of ambitions for this sector and wants to make of it a locomotive of, or the engine of, the Algerian economy. And what should we do? So this is the question. On the clear basis that will allow tomorrow to ask for accountability, because it's one of the basic principles of good governance based or according to what OECD says, which is virtually present amongst amongst us actually through Mr. Hans. So we should select the man so that the public company responds or meets those expectations. So after this introduction, long introduction, so this is the future of the directors. Who could be directors? What the director does, what the board of directors does. So its roles, its prerogatives, its missions, and this is what I'm going to talk about very quickly, because I don't want Mr. Burnan to remind me of the time that is allotted to me, because I think that is just signaling to me to go straight to the core of the subject. So the board of directors, as you may all know, is a collegial body made up of directors appointed by the shareholder, which is the state, based on competency and independence basis or criteria. So we said that a director cannot be appointed by the ministry. So it's an incompatibility case provided by the Code of Public Function. But unfortunately, it's not the case all the time. Independence is extremely important to allow, as a matter of fact, to the directors to exercise in all sovereignty their duties in the interest of their companies. So thank you, Mr. Burnan, who said earlier that we should work for the efficiency, the profitability, and the profit generation of the company. So this is a wish that deserves to be fulfilled. What are or who are the actors of the board of directors? You know that we have the PCA, the Director General, except when the Director General is the President Director General of the company. I cannot present the whole thing to you. Some have a mandate of director, sometimes they're the head of other subsidiaries of companies. So on account of the limited time that I have, I cannot make the presentation of all those people. So try to be indulgent with me, Mr. Bornan, because I'm the only woman that is making an intervention in this seminar. So I'm asking for the implementation of the Muslim law. So I'm counting on your indulgence not to stop me in the middle of my presentation. So the board of directors, which is a body, as I said it before, a body of management and the control of management. However, it's a body of decision making, but which doesn't meet regularly. There are questions related to logistics, to finance, to availability that prevent the board of directors from meeting all the time, but meeting only 4 times a year. So can we really control, can we really detect all the risks that could pose a threat to the operation of the company by convening only 4 meetings a year? So a thought should be conducted in the matter. So the frequency of meetings of the board of directors, which are not sufficient to my own opinion. it's probably due to the fact
Board of directors,
that
which are not
the directors receive attendance fees, and the companies are afraid to pay more money to those directors. But I think in my capacity as a director myself, I think that it's not a hurdle to the organizing or the meeting or the holding of meetings of the board of directors. So this is a stumbling block that we have to remedy. So the trade code talks only about the figures and doesn't focus on the most important points, which is to require from the directors a certain number of conditions of eligibility. So the number I find out of my own experience in the field that the number is insufficient. So the number is generally revolving around 5 per law. It's insufficient when we want to inject the famous specialized committee which are emanating from the board of directors and which are supposed to bring the expertise and the critical point of view for the work of the company. So the number should be thought of by those people who put in place the board of directors. So I always go back to the composition of the board of directors, to the famous representative of workers. We have not invented anything. The participation, the financial participation of the workers is codified by Article 502 of the French Code. We borrowed it from the French Code, and we inherited from the GSE. When we look at the ordinance 6171 of the Workers' Code, we provide for the board of directors because it doesn't exist in the countries. And in an approach of identification to the company, a feeling of belonging. So if I am part of the board of directors, I have to feel home and I have to make of my scheme the most profitable ever. Only in the countries that codified the participation of workers in the management of the company could represent them or actually appoint their representatives amongst the executives who have a minimum of intellectual level and also a good command of the core product or service of the company. So here, the representatives of the workers are coming from workers that don't have any level, and they come to the board of directors meeting to talk about anything and disturb the session. So here we have to think about how to improve the level of the representatives of the board of directors to have more efficiency. Here, the board of directors invite the ministries to which the EPEs are linked to try to recruit or hire amongst the experts and also the executives outside of this sector, autonomous and independent. And finally, the role of the board of directors. The board of directors, which is the pivotal organ for the success of the company, that polarized all the interest and attention of the specialist of the organization science in general and of the companies in particular will tell you that it's the one that manages on a regular basis. So we have to take good care of it, but we have to control it at the same time. So the state, which is represented in the control organs or bodies, such as the board of directors, which is well composed with transparent, fair, just, and loyal members, will have decisions oriented to the management of company, advise the team and the managers, and also the second hat is to manage or to control the management of the company. And I think that is not the case, unfortunately. I have a little experience as director, and I doubt that it happens this way. So the third point of vigilance, we have to work in a way that the board of directors plays its role as a pivotal element in the good governance. So I think that I'm going to go beyond the powers of the board of directors, because you know them. I limited myself to list them based on the Code of Commerce. I listed them one by one. So is it worthy to say it? I agree with Mr. Bilmihoub. I'm going to go beyond this, but I'm going to go back to the previous slide and say that the board of directors should look the President Director General in the eyes and say that I don't agree when the decision is not appropriate for them. So the board of directors has to play its role fully. I'm sure that I'm going to contribute administrator of the director, in the good governance of the company. 3 conditions, sine qua non conditions: competency, engagement or commitment, and accountability. So it's responsibility in the jargon of good governance. So it belongs to the state to enhance the level of requirements vis-a-vis the directors. So there is another question, legal question, that may not please you, which is about the partnership, the new investment law, 51.49%. The law is very clear. It requires that the director is a shareholder, which means that they have if you are in front of somebody that want to protect themselves, so they go to their statutory auditor. The statutory auditor has the responsibility to inform the the General Assembly that Mr. Tier, for example, Mr. Akho, and the gentleman from Sonelgaz are directors in this company and don't hold any shares. So the director who doesn't have any shares is noted as dismissing if they don't regulate the situation after 3 months of the incident. So you may tell me that it's just words and no action has been taken against that. But I'd like to tell you that all the decisions that have been taken by board of directors with directors who don't have any shares are nil and void. And this means that all the decisions and resolutions that you are going to come up with will be nil and void and will be neglected. So we have to be very cautious and very careful as to this particular point. So even if I tell you that the requirements of holding shares is excluded by fact and not by law for public companies, but it's there for the company, the joint companies and the companies that involve third parties coming from abroad. So the workers don't have the right, or the employees don't have the right to be directors in companies. It's an incompatibility. I'm not going to cite them all. So you have the accumulation of mandate, no more than 5. For the companies, it's different because it's not limited, so that we could allow them to have as many subsidiaries as they want. It's forbidden for a director to become an employee in the company because it will pose a conflict of interest. And the question related to nationality was an interesting point for researchers in many countries, but it hasn't been evoked by the Algerian law. There is a decree for the foreign directors that stipulates that the foreign director has to have a professional card when they are director. Those work permits will allow them to be directors. So is it allowed in public companies? I say yes, by fact and not by law, because the foreign partner appoints directors of its nationality. So we have already spoken about competency. And we have another question relating to mixity in the board of directors. Women are not deprived from intelligence and from being able of being part of the board of directors. When I speak about mixity, I speak about the gender, men and women. We have another mixity, which is the mixture of generations. So the old ones who are experienced with the youth who are energetic. So thinking about these elements and coming up with recommendations is not completely useless, and we have already said it and reiterated several times. And I think that if we strive doing this, we will end up coming up to a positive point. So the most important person is in the board of directors is the chairman of the board of directors. So it has, or he has, a mandate and has to implement it as a good family father. So he has to take care of it as if he takes care of his own family, based on the discretion and the non-disclosure of any element that emanate from the board of directors. But, you know, our culture is a culture of leaks, so we cannot keep confidential any point that we come up with. So we have to, and it's also cultural actually to be always detecting any shortcoming or any bad points that has been implemented or done by the company. So we have the obligation of loyalty, prohibiting, code of ethics, the internal regulations. So we always say that the internal regulations of the board of directors should be accompanied by a charter of ethics. So if the chairman allows me to say a word on the responsibility, otherwise I'll stop. So I've already said it, so I stop. So a long sentence to conclude with. The director has two responsibilities: civil and penal responsibilities. The penal responsibility, I think that we should not depenalize it, because we engage its penal responsibility when we have deliberately violated a text of law. And this is a legal point in terms of responsibility, and the civil act is to do it even though the law prohibits it. So why do you want to steal when you know that stealing is prohibited by the law? When an offense is an offense, we have to assume our responsibility. So I'm going to summarize what I'm going to say now. We have the penal responsibility, the civil responsibility. Mind you that in all the meetings I explain the same thing. Especially, I guess that some of you have already heard that, and with the age, we tend to forget what we said. So the civil responsibility is ensured. There are insurance companies such as AXA, CAR, so I think that we have people from Snatchrock here. So other insurance companies insure the civil protection or civil responsibility of the managers. So we have to subscribe to an insurance policy, and in the event of violating the law, I am tempted to display the civil policy of cash, which is outstanding, which is really excellent. If you make a management mistake, it's not you who will pay back for it. So you made a mistake, it jeopardized actually the company. It's the insurance company that pays instead of you. So we have to develop this culture. The cultural problems are tremendous here. And we have talked long about that. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope I didn't bother you with my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Maybe before speaking about some points, I would like to invite the journalists to go and meet at the press place. Mrs. I gave you the time you asked for two reasons. First of all, as a former director in the board of directors, I've worked with legal people who are so much minutious in their work that we need to make to pay attention to this. And second point is that I worked in the development area, and I think that it is very important to involve the youth and the women who have a lot of experience. And as you said, this is a point that needs to be improved. You've talked about very important points. So first of all, I would like to invite the president of the Knesset to organize a meeting on the architecture of the governance. Professor Kroon, what you've said is very important. There are numerous situations, diverse situations. China is not managing in the same way as India is managing, so they have different models of management. So I think it would be interesting to have a session, a particular session on this subject. Madam, you were right to focus on several points. I think that among these points, there's one that is related to the quality of men, of people, and the risk related is really very important. And you have also the necessity of independence, that it is really fundamental. You know, at the international level, we say that we need to go into boards of directors with 9 members. That's the optimal number. The issue of workers, with the intervention of our friend Dr. Pierre Bobby, I think we will tackle this issue. I know that in the French companies, the representation of workers is made independently, and not everyone is allowed to represent the work. I think this is an important point. And the diversity of profiles, I think it's important also in order to function well. The board of directors has to be made of specialists in this sector. We need to have a diversity of profiles. That is very important. You also talked about an important point, which is the independence of the administrator or director. From my own experience, I was director in the development bank in Africa, and I could not attend. There were implications as a manager. I was backed by an insurance in case of problems that's concerning practical issues. I have to say it, I was a troublemaker at the board of directors, and many times the CEOs asked for my head, and they asked to dismiss me because every time there's an investment project that was presented, I did long research to see to do the diligence that is needed. I played my role as a director, and I hampered the functioning of the board of directors. So that was part of my job. You know how to multinational companies try to influence. So at 2 times they declined dismissing me. They said that the board of directors has named him. We cannot dismiss him. So these are practical elements that I add to what you've presented and that I think are important. I think the issue of the risk management is a fundamental one. I think that if there's a training, the training need not only to be for the directors, but to all the elements of the system, those that could be in courts. Unfortunately, in our countries, maybe with the exception of Anglo-Saxon countries, the judges are not trained in this field, and the mistake could be fatal. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Pierre Bobby. I hope he's online. I hope that you will allow me, Pierre, to be more strict in terms of timing, because you're not a legal expert and you're not a woman. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et tous.
Hello, everybody.
Invitation à venir partager avec vous.
I am delighted to share with you my knowledge and my experience.
Ce qu'on a vu depuis ce matin, c'est que il n'y a pas de solution idéale.
What we've seen this morning is that there is no ideal solution,
La moins mauvaise solution,
but we need to choose the less
extrêmement complexe.
bad
Effectivement,
decision.
il y a beaucoup de tensions.
There's a lot of tension.
Parce que les objectifs sont
The actors are different and the objectives are different,
au milieu de toutes
but
ces
we
tensions,
try in the middle.
La meilleure ou la moins mauvaise solution. Alors, on m'a demandé de traiter du sujet, la gouvernance des entreprises publiques en situation de monopole. On en a connu et on en connaît beaucoup. Et à partir de là, la place, le rôle, les fonctions des conseils d'administration. Alors, je pense que vous allez pouvoir voir la présentation que j'ai faite, que j'ai préparée à cet effet, pour essayer d'éclairer ces différentes dimensions en fonction de l'expérience française. Et ça m'amène d'abord, en quelques mots, à revenir sur ce qu'est la gouvernance. La gouvernance, c'est pas le gouvernement, c'est quelque chose de plus complexe, de plus interactif entre les différents acteurs, entre les différents niveaux territoriaux, entre l'économique, le social et l'environnemental aujourd'hui, le sociétal, des objectifs plus ou moins politiques et de stratégie de développement. Gouvernance, c'est quelque chose de complexe, d'interactif entre des acteurs différents qui ont des objectifs complémentaires et parfois opposés. Un monopole naturel, c'est la situation qui existe d'un certain nombre de domaines d'infrastructures, dans le domaine de l'énergie, des transports, des communications, qui font que on reconnaît, et tous les acteurs reconnaissent, que la mise en concurrence des réseaux d'infrastructures serait un gaspillage économique, financier, humain, et qu'il vaut mieux avoir dans certains domaines un monopole naturel et souvent confié à une entreprise publique. C'est ce que je vais essayer d'éclaircir ici, évidemment, en la matière, à partir de l'expérience française. Je crois que je vais essayer de parler à partir de là, c'est le prochain slide, je vais essayer d'aborder à partir de l'exemple d'EDF, que j'ai bien connu pour y avoir travaillé pendant une trentaine d'années, et pour essayer de tirer des enseignements de cette expérience-là en fonction de son histoire, de ses évolutions. EDF a eu la caractéristique d'avoir un système de gouvernance stable pendant 50 ans. On l'a vu tout à l'heure, quand vous parliez de l'Algérie, qui a eu des séries d'évolutions, d'inflexions. Là, on a eu un cas d'étude tout à fait intéressant, puisque on a eu un modèle stable pendant 50 ans, qui provient de l'histoire. L'histoire, effectivement, de l'électricité, qui a commencé par une source d'énergie décentralisée, locale, privée, des initiatives privées et concurrentielles, et qui a abouti progressivement à partir d'une évolution qui a duré jusqu'au lendemain de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, qui a abouti à la reconnaissance du monopole et au rôle de l'État et à la nationalisation des compagnies privées qui existaient auparavant. Ça a amené à la naissance de ce qu'on a appelé le modèle EDF, c'est-à-dire la nationalisation des entreprises privées d'électricité qui existaient auparavant, qui est à la fois le résultat d'une histoire et en même temps qui est le résultat de la nécessité au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale de reconstruire le pays et de le faire avec tous les acteurs concernés, c'est-à-dire de faire converger tous les acteurs. Il y a eu à l'époque un large consensus sur le fait qu'il fallait nationaliser, qu'il fallait un monopole public chargé à la fois de la production, du transport, de la distribution et de la commercialisation de l'électricité en France. C'est un modèle que j'ai décrit avec un petit schéma que vous allez sans doute pouvoir voir, qui s'appliquait à la France, monopole national, qui s'appliquait avec une entreprise publique, 100% publique, avec des missions de service public, égalité, continuité et ainsi de suite, qui a été dans les faits une institution et une entreprise centralisée, qui avait comme ambition de couvrir l'ensemble du territoire national, donc une dimension universelle, qui était un modèle intégré, donc production, transport, distribution, et qui est resté stable pendant 50 ans. Les fondations de ce modèle, c'est la propriété publique, qui avait des investissements lourds, à longue durée de vie, industrie très capitalistique et nécessité d'une programmation à long terme, autant d'éléments qui ne correspondaient pas aux objectifs des entreprises privées et des règles de marché. Donc, entreprise 100% publique, ce qu'on a appelé un EPIC, établissement public, industriel et commercial, avec un conseil d'administration. Conseil d'administration tripartite, un tiers de représentants de l'État, un tiers de représentants des personnels, de ceux qui travaillent dans l'entreprise, et un tiers, alors on a dit au départ, de personnalités qualifiées, et puis c'est devenu progressivement, c'était représentant donc des utilisateurs individuels ou industriels ou économiques, et c'est devenu des personnalités qualifiées nommées par l'État. Et on voit que là, il y a eu un premier entorse à l'initiative de départ. Quand on dit 3 tiers, ça voulait dire qu'il pouvait y avoir des discussions, des négociations pour trouver les meilleures solutions au cas par cas de l'ordre du jour des réunions du conseil d'administration. Et on va voir que la dérive qu'il y a eu, à partir de là, ça a été un modèle dans lequel le conseil d'administration est devenu plutôt une chambre d'enregistrement qu'un organe réel de décision, d'orientation et de gouvernance. Entreprise publique, mission de service public, égalité, continuité, adaptabilité, cette conception du service public était inhérent, conjugué avec les objectifs de l'entreprise publique. Et une doctrine a été progressivement élaboré, je pense en particulier à Marcel Boiteux, qui a été l'animateur, le concepteur de cette doctrine, d'une doctrine intégrée, rigoureuse, mathématisée, associant rationalité économique et justice sociale, combinant ces deux dimensions. L'optimum d'avoir un monopole, en l'occurrence, invention de ce qu'on va appeler le taux d'actualisation permettant la planification des investissements à long terme, tarification au coût marginal avec égalité de traitement de tous les utilisateurs. Dans les faits, ce modèle idéal, qui encore une fois a vécu bon an, mal an pendant 50 ans et a structuré la gouvernance dans l'entreprise pendant 50 ans. Ce modèle idéal n'était pas aussi idéal que ça a pu paraître. D'abord parce qu'il y avait une dualité d'orientation et de contrôle. L'État, les ministères qui se sont succédés, ministère de l'énergie au départ, puis intégration dans le ministère de l'économie et des finances, ce rôle de l'État qui avait un rôle essentiel, s'est conjugué avec une montée en puissance de compétences techniques, administratives, économiques, financières à l'intérieur d'EDF, du management d'EDF, qui est venu plus ou moins en tension, en conflit avec le rôle de l'État. Un peu un double légitimité de l'État d'un côté et de l'autre côté des dirigeants de l'entreprise. Et un déséquilibre qui s'est créé, car il y a eu, dès le départ, et plus encore ensuite, des asymétries d'information, de compétences, d'expertise entre l'État et le management d'EDF. Et on a pu voir de ce point de vue-là le management d'EDF prendre le pas progressivement sur les compétences de l'État, et donc on a pu parler de l'EDF définissant la politique énergétique de la France avec ses compétences et son expertise. On a même pu parler, à propos d'EDF, d'État dans l'État. Le rôle du gouvernement et des ministères n'a pas disparu pour autant, mais il a été essentiellement conjoncturel, ça a été un rôle de tutelle gouvernementale et administrative qui a compensé le monopole d'expertise qu'avait EDF par des interventions conjoncturelles, tatillonnes et instruments d'une politique industrielle. Donc, une perversion en la matière qui a existé. Ça renvoie à ce que j'appelle les apories du monopole. Le monopole, c'est évident pour les réseaux d'infrastructures, c'est évident dans des domaines comme celui de l'électricité, des chemins de fer, des communications et ainsi de suite, mais ça a des défauts. Le monopole n'est pas l'idéal de la situation parce qu'il peut, tout monopole, public comme privé, peut abuser de sa situation de monopole. Il peut en abuser parce qu'il a une rente informationnelle, rente de compétences, rente technique, compétences rente de monopole, qui lui permet d'abuser de sa situation. Et ça ramène à la question fondamentale, qu'est-ce que le pilotage public ? Pourquoi y a-t-il des entreprises publiques ? La motivation des entreprises publiques peut être soit défensive, soit offensive. Défensive en cas de crise, protéger un secteur en crise, protéger un secteur ou une entreprise au risque de faillite. Ou offensive, c'est-à-dire promouvoir l'innovation, promouvoir des objectifs de politique publique, promouvoir des missions de service public. Donc déjà, une double tension, motivation défensive ou offensive. Les responsabilités des autorités publiques sont essentielles, car elles doivent définir les objectifs, les missions des entreprises publiques. Et En même temps, elles doivent développer de réelles capacités de pilotage, de contrôle et d'évaluation. Mais on a vu, dans le cas d'EDF, que c'était l'asymétrie qui régnait en la matière. De ce point de vue, on n'a pas parlé encore ce matin d'un concept qui me semble tout à fait intéressant, celui d'autorité organisatrice, qui me semble pertinent. Autorité organisatrice, c'est une autorité publique qui a des missions d'autorité publique, qui a la responsabilité de définir les objectifs, les missions, le mode d'organisation et de fonctionnement, mais qui ne vient pas s'ingérer dans la gestion de l'entreprise. On parlait tout à l'heure qu'il fallait être, que l'État ne devait être ni passif ni interventionniste. Il faut trouver un équilibre entre les deux, une tension entre ces deux dimensions-là, et l'autorité organisatrice, elle doit permettre justement d'avoir cette double dimension. Et à partir de là, la réflexion, c'est d'essayer d'avoir une gouvernance qui associe les différentes parties prenantes. On est dans des domaines dont le monopole public est justifié par des objectifs, des missions, mais tout le monde n'a pas la même vision, n'a pas les mêmes intérêts en la matière. Il faut donc essayer de promouvoir un système dans lequel il puisse y avoir expression de la diversité des attentes, aspirations et souhaits des participants, et dans lequel il puisse y avoir des choix, des arbitrages qui soient accomplis par l'entreprise d'un côté, par l'autorité publique de l'autre, avec bien sûr un lien entre les deux. La France a inventé, à partir de 2004, une nouvelle instance pour essayer de régler ce problème de gouvernance publique. C'est l'Agence des participations de l'État, créée en 2004 pour que l'État assure ce rôle d'actionnaire à 100%, ou à moins d'ailleurs dans certains cas, d'actionnaire des entreprises publiques, pour veiller donc aux intérêts patrimoniaux de l'État. Agence des participations de l'État qui a visé au renforcement des pouvoirs des organes sociaux, conseil d'administration, conseil et ainsi de suite, diversification de leur composition, qui n'est pas uniquement, et donc en particulier promotion de l'égalité entre les hommes et les femmes, et ainsi de suite, et élimination des conflits d'intérêts pour assurer la continuité et les qualités des débats et de l'information financière. Avec l'APE, l'État essaye de disposer de meilleurs moyens de pilotage et de contrôle. Mais on a toujours le même système de déséquilibre et d'asymétrie. À l'APE, il y a environ une cinquantaine de personnes aujourd'hui, beaucoup d'experts, mais qui y travaillent, mais une cinquantaine. Il y a à EDF, mais on pourrait prendre, puisque l'APE est en charge de toutes les entreprises publiques, il y a à EDF des dizaines et des centaines d'experts techniques, économiques, financiers, et ainsi de suite. Mais il y a pareil à la SNCF, il y a pareil dans toutes les entreprises. L'asymétrie ne peut pas être complètement éliminée, quels que soient les objectifs et les moyens que peut avoir l'APE en la matière. Et ça m'amène, réflexion et les travaux que j'ai pu conduire en la matière, à penser qu'il faut passer d'une régulation d'experts. On peut avoir de plus en plus d'experts au niveau du gouvernement, ils n'arriveront jamais à combler les asymétries structurelles qui existent. Passer d'une régulation d'experts à une régulation d'acteurs. Et pour ce faire participer à la gouvernance, d'une part, les organisations syndicales et les travailleurs de l'entreprise, d'autre part, les différents utilisateurs, les usagers, mais les utilisateurs économiques industriels, petits et grandes entreprises, à chaque niveau territorial, y compris les représentants des collectivités territoriales, car quand on parle d'une entreprise publique nationale comme la France, les territoires qui sont couverts dans un pays comme la France ont des diversités extrêmement importantes de situations, d'enjeux et de besoins. Et donc, associer tous les acteurs concernés est un moyen de renforcer, je crois, la gouvernance des entreprises publiques. C'est ça qui m'amène à penser qu'on peut essayer, de ce point de vue-là, d'une part, de trouver des solutions pour que le conseil d'administration ne soit ni une chambre d'enregistrement, ce que ça a été beaucoup dans le cas d'EDF. Pourquoi? Conseil d'administration tripartite, le gouvernement, les pouvoirs publics, avec leurs propres objectifs conjoncturels, à préparer le conseil d'administration. Puis, un tiers de personnalités qualifiées, qui étaient souvent des responsables de grandes entreprises, des responsables de collectivités territoriales. Ça, c'est déjà 2/3 qui pouvaient préparer les objectifs. Le 3e tiers, représentants des personnels et des organisations syndicales, qui à partir de 1981 ont été élus. Il y a tous les 6 ans, élection des représentants des personnels au conseil d'administration. Mais ils sont dans une situation délicate, ces représentants des personnels, même s'ils sont élus et s'ils ont la légitimité de l'élection et du corps social d'EDF. Ils ont l'enjeu important, c'est qu'ils ont un devoir de réserve comme administration. Ils n'ont pas le droit de rendre compte au personnel directement du secret des délibérations du conseil d'administration. Ils n'ont pas le droit de préparer un peu, mais avec des assemblées de personnel, ce qu'ils vont dire au conseil d'administration. Ils ont un rôle de porte-parole, mais dans les faits, pour ne pas que le conseil d'administration soit un champ clos de conflits, eh bien, le conseil d'administration a davantage été une chambre d'enregistrement que d'un lieu réel de gouvernance. D'où l'idée qu'on peut avancer aujourd'hui de mettre en place, d'inventer un système hybride. On en parlait tout à l'heure dans l'exposé qui a été fait sur ce système avec à la fois un directoire en charge de mettre en œuvre les orientations et avec des compétences et des capacités de décision et d'autonomie, et un conseil de surveillance qui puisse, lui, rassembler tous les acteurs concernés et qui puisse à la fois surveiller, contrôler, évaluer l'efficacité du directoire et pouvoir... alors, c'est un système hybride dans lequel ça ne résout pas tous les conflits, bien évidemment. Les conflits sont inhérents à l'existence des entreprises publiques avec situation de monopole, mais qui permet de mettre un certain nombre de conflits sur la place publique, de démocratiser en quelque sorte la gouvernance pour permettre à chacun des acteurs de jouer son rôle, aux dirigeants de l'entreprise, eh bien de manager l'entreprise et de la faire fonctionner, mais en même temps aux autorités publiques et aux différents acteurs d'exprimer leurs attentes, leurs aspirations et d'assurer un contrôle démocratique sur la vie de l'entreprise. Alors, c'est peut-être un peu utopique, c'est pas l'idéal non plus, car ça ne fait pas disparaître les tensions, mais ça peut être une piste pour essayer de résoudre le problème qu'on a tous ici autour de la table et avec tous les participants, c'est d'inventer un système qui soit le mieux à même de résoudre les enjeux et de permettre aux entreprises publiques d'assurer leur rôle et donc de permettre le développement économique, social, sociétal de chacun de nos pays. Voilà, j'ai peut-être été un petit peu long, excusez-moi, mais j'ai essayé d'apporter quelques éléments dans la matière pour complexifier, mais en même temps des pistes peut-être pour tenir compte de ce que nous avons vécu les uns et les autres. Merci de votre attention.
what you've said about EDF and the state's involvement and the investment that EDF had to conduct, especially in England, show well the issues of governance that are happening. I think that Total, to quote just this group, has the same perspective and the same trend.
So I'm going to open the debate now for everybody, but the question that comes to mind now that I would like to ask to you and to Hans is whether we could envisage a unique model or pattern of good governance for other countries, or should we think about a variable geometry or geometric governance adapted to each company, so based on the environment where we are, based on the various types of companies, and what are the involvements in terms of size and involvement and the members of board of directors. So I open up the debate if there are questions, interventions, comments by the audience. Please introduce yourselves. Good morning. So since the Mrs. Linda Sadloud, I am a lawyer and I'm a researcher. I don't give the title of my thesis, but it's on good governance and its impact on the local level. Mrs. Arkoun talked about the management of the decriminalization of the Management Act, and we gave a round of applause about the depenalization or the decriminalization of the mode of management, of the act of management. But the thing is that we don't have a clear model of the act of management here. We copied from other countries, but we didn't copy the whole thing. When we depenalize entirely the act of management without setting up controllers and without giving a clear definition, clear-cut definition of the act of depenalization, so we leave judicial vacuums here, and this could lead to many problems for the administration in public or private companies. It's the same. It's all the same. Another point, I would say that the training and the hiring of managers is not always done based on the objectives of the company or the public company. So the public company in Algeria, we cannot change mentalities from ever since the shift from socialism to capitalism. So a company should generate profit. It can't do otherwise. It's not because the share or the capital is public, so the company could allow itself to engage or embark in a random management, and the company is not accountable for its management. This is not normal. It's not normal at all, and this should or could jeopardize the state and the company alike, and should be subjected to a meticulous and rigorous control. And when it comes to the civil and penal responsibility or liability of the company regarding all the offenses that are defined by the state, it's not advised or not recommended to decriminalize or exclude the managers from this legal pursuit. There is no reason whatsoever for a manager to be sued in justice or in court for a dilapidation of public funds. I would also speak about a particular case concerning a company settled in France after the Second World War. It's a big company called Lafarge. The union of the company Lafarge managed to have what they called a heritage, because they deemed after 4 years that the employees of Lafarge had anti-patriotic actions, and it was the first time that a union, which is a minority in a private company, could have this legal pursuit, and it was a historic event. Thank you. Thank you, madam. I think I can see 2 hands raised. Doctor, please, could you look at this direction? Go ahead, please. Thank you. On the name of Allah, and without further ado, Dr. Dardour Isa, I am the representative of the Algerian Employers Organization or Union, chaired by Mr. Nate Abdelaziz, and in my capacity as the chairman of the Confederation of Hotels and Tourism. As you mentioned in the beginning of this encounter, so the stakeholders, the economic stakeholders or players, and you also talked about the social stakeholders with the public company in the search of an economic or a management pattern. So this starts from an economic territory that could benefit from other experiences, but it should reach a personal design or pattern that meets all the specificities of the regional stakeholders who are the decision makers in the company. So I take an example of this approach that we are trying to implement as economic players. So to be precise in my question, we went to the National Office for the Tourism Promotion. Since 2019, we managed to have a permanent committee to materialize this under the form of a tourist compound, 3 clubs, environmental tourism for the Algerian families. As the French professor said it, using the words attacking and defending. Today, we are witnessing an approach of defense to face up to the crisis, and as we drew as lessons from the conference of the ILO conference, and as Professor Akron said it, while focusing on the ethics of the manager as an economic partner or as a board of director to meet the expectations of the regional, of the local citizens in their needs. And this is the expectation that the board of directors is striving to implement. So the public board of directors or the private board of directors that don't have any accountability for their companies we should give the equation an economic point of view, and as the expert said it earlier, the expert in the legal field. So if you could please summarize your question, because we have other interventions from abroad and we have to respect the time. Through our participation, we'd like to draw the attention on the public operators without any distinction between private and public operators is based on the wealth generation with national and local designs. Thank you very much, sir. With your permission, we will come back to the debate afterwards, because one of the presenters, Mr. Ashraf Jamaldeen, has other commitments, so it would be beneficial for us to take advantage of his experience at the head of the Institute of Directors, which is based on the UAE, and then we resume our debate. Gamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with you, and I can see some old friends from the OECD. So, so my name is Ashraf Gamal. I am from Egypt. I was actually part of the management where we were doing a lot of corporate governance work for the state-owned enterprises, as well as for listed companies. I moved to Dubai 7 years ago, where again, we are doing the same thing in حوكمة, which is a corporate governance institute owned by the Dubai government. And we work with the regulators, we work with the companies directly, and we create calibers and create directors for companies, if you like. So without further ado, I'd like to start my presentation. Are you going to share it from your side, or should I share my screen? Okay, thank you so much. Can I go to the next slide, please? So again, as I said, we are actually a non-for-profit organization, and we have been operating since 2006. But what I will be talking about today is not only from our experience in حوكمة in dealing with some of the state-owned enterprises here in the GCC countries, because we operate not only in the UAE but in the GCC countries, but also my experience in Egypt when I was heavily involved in this file in Egypt. Next slide, please. Okay, so I don't think there's enough time for this, but I think one of the key elements where we have been doing is we do have an ESG index that we run with S&P, Standard & Poor's in the region. This gets us a lot of information about companies, their sustainability reports, corporate governance practices, their boards of directors, and so on. And I think, again, this is very valuable. We have lots of resources in our website, which is on the bottom of the slide. So please, if you'd like to have more information, go there. And I would like to start my presentation. Okay, so usually when I start to talk about SOEs, I like to go back to fundamentals a little bit. So I'd like to draw your attention to the simple definition of corporate governance by Sir Adrian Cadbury, which is a system by which companies are directed and controlled. Now, the OECD definition has much more details about, the distribution of power and responsibilities and authority between the shareholders, management, stakeholders, and the board of directors of the companies. Now, the reason why I'd like to go back to that, level is simply because that's where really the issues start. Okay. Let me. Now, there are key pillars, if you like, or key principles of governance, which are supposed to be available in any company, whether that's privately owned or a state-owned company. Now, the first one of them is responsibility. So usually when we talk about corporate governance, we talk about responsibility, whether this is responsibility is of the owners of the company, the board of directors, the management of the company. It is basically responsibility to all the stakeholders of the organization. And the other thing which is connected to that is accountability, which means that since certain parties are responsible, they are giving the powers, the authority, and the resources, then they have to be held accountable. Whether we talk about the management, the board, the majority stakeholders or shareholders of the companies, they need to be held accountable for whatever happens in these companies. And the third one is fairness, which means we need to be fair, fair to all the shareholders, small and large shareholders, fair to all the stakeholders, and fair to the society at large. And then finally, one of the key principles is disclosure and transparency, by which we say that we need to make sure that we disclose information properly in the right times, in the right format, whether this is financial, non-financial, about the governance, the ownership, the board of directors, results, financial performance, and so on. Okay. Now, if everyone here listening to me would just try to apply these four principles on state-owned enterprises, you might find out the challenges before even I go on in my presentation. So it is really quite important to keep in mind these four sort of principles of corporate governance. Now, if we just go back a little bit back on the OECD, when they published the first guidelines of corporate governance in 1991, that was for listed companies and maybe financial institutions. It's only a few years later they realized that state-owned companies are still very important. Now, I did have a slide on the percentage of SOEs in employment in the OECD countries. I took it out because it is very small as compared to other countries in the world. So maybe talk about 2, 3, 4%. That's much smaller than the size of SOEs in our own countries. And that's why the OECD came out with a code of corporate governance or suggested guidelines for state-owned assets in 2004. That was updated in 2015 as well. Now, let's talk about the boards of directors, because, again, this is really the key element that we discussed today. Now, the board of directors of companies is really responsible for four key areas. I mean, under each one of them, there are much more details we have no time to talk about today. But then the first thing is the foresight of the company. So the foresight of the company, the vision and the mission of the company, this is something which boards should be doing. Second thing is the strategy, which is how to convert and how to translate, the vision and the mission of the company into strategy and into action. This is actually responsibility of the board. And in this, we talk also about risk, for example, risk appetite and control of risk. That's part of the board responsibility as well.
Yeah, Gamal, we are missing what you are saying. Huh? I think there is a problem of connection. Hello? Hello? Je crois qu'on l'a perdu. Ah. Hello? Est-ce qu'il y a un technicien?
Is there any technician to check with the connection here?
Non, je crois que...
I think that we... I'm sorry, but we have to interrupt the presentation, maybe, because it doesn't go through, which is a pity because he was speaking about a controversial point in his presentation regarding the discrimination with the private sector. I hope that we will be able to resume it afterwards. So if you can...
It is, you are again connected, we will resume. Thank you. Donc, on revient au...
So we come back to the discussions pending his reconnection. I think that we have two people who wanted to take the floor. Good morning, Mr. Aytahman. I'm here as part of the representation of the private UNEP, which is the private entrepreneurs. Mr. the Chairman apologized to Mr. the Chairman of the CNAS for not being able to attend. I was impressed by the quality of the interventions, even though the legal side took the lead, because in our capacity as public managers we are confronted with a big issue, which is the relationship that we have with the legal aspect. And I was impressed by the quality of the presentations. In terms of the concerns at UNEP, the public managers are confronted for years now with such questions as, I am accountable or I am manager? Because being accountable for having fulfilled its mission and being up to the responsibilities that we have on our back is really important. But for the law, for the Algerian law, we're still shareholders. Here we go back to another problem that is commonly known as the decriminalization or depenalization of the act of management, as Mr. Akroun said it. First of all, we are Algerian citizens entrusted with a mission and duties, and we are complying with the legal framework in the country. So shall we go to the extent of defining what is the act of management? So it's not our responsibility. It rests with the concerned institutions to do what they should do in this field. The most important thing for us is, over the last years, we have witnessed a great breakthrough in terms of governance. And as you mentioned it earlier, within the board of directors, you have to have a certain number of qualities. We tend to forget the problem of culture, because our culture as people doesn't allow us to distinguish between what is social and what is state-owned. Are we talking about the social goods or the goods of the state? What do we mean by the merchant capital of the state? Are we talking about the economic aspect here or else? So we have to define all these aspects so that everybody could do their job easily. So the reality is imposing that on us, and the COVID pandemic is also imposing on us to be cautious, prudent, and careful, because the celerity in the economic context demonstrated that in our procedures and processes we have a lot of red tape, bureaucracy, and heavy processes. Thank you very much, Mr. Jamal. Good morning, everyone. I think that the situation of the public sector in Algeria is today really delicate, but at the same time has a development potential. And this is why the issue of governance becomes urgent, and its reform should be a matter of concern for all. As my colleague that preceded me mentioned it, there is a confusion between the state, which is the owner and has a right on companies, and we have the state, which is a shareholder, which has liabilities towards the companies. This is the crucial question. So the state, in its capacity as owner, has rights, and in its capacity as shareholder has liabilities towards the company. So we have several aspects. The first aspect was mentioned by my colleague Yarout, which is the representation within the board of directors of employees who represent big companies more often. And when they are members of the board of directors, they wear the hat of the representatives of the ministries or big companies, and give the impression that they give an order, not participate in the board of directors, because they have the legitimacy of holding information and giving orientations and guidance. The other directors will follow them. This is the first ticket on which the reform should focus and reduce the powers of representative of a ministry or administration that could have an extensive power or authority on the company. On the other hand, we have what has been mentioned by Mr. Bobby, what we call technocracy in some of the big Algerian companies. I don't say that this is a bad point. On the contrary, we should consolidate it and reinforce it. And as it was the case for EDF in France, where public politics have influenced actually the state to take investment and management decisions which weren't justified by their expertise, their political weight. They influence the public decisions, and sometimes on investment, on political decisions that engage the state and the company. We have to make a difference or distinguish between these technocratic powers within big companies. When it comes to regulated sectors in Algeria, the powers of these technocratic elements vis-à-vis the regulation authority, which are relatively young, they don't have extensive competency, and they have to comply, to listen, or to follow this technocracy that exists in public companies. So the governance should deal with these points. And governance is also about sharing, to have the same information so that the board of director could deliberate and issue resolutions to avoid what Mr. Boubi said earlier, the asymmetrical information or the imbalance in the deal of information that is held by each party. So in my opinion, the reform of the merchant public sector should integrate this governance and fight against the discriminate powers, because there is no worse than the existence of discriminatory powers that exist within companies. So some have good command of the subject and impose their own decisions, which are most of the time not in the interest of the public company. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor to bring my contribution. So in a microeconomic way, first of all, I'd like to precise that the Algerian public companies, because it's about the subject matter of today's seminar. Today we have 33 large state or public groups, which have under their banner 500 companies around the territory. It's tremendous in terms of collaboration. So these companies should play a pivotal role in the economic boost. So we have to meet all the criteria, of course, and I could mention that you talked earlier about the revival and also the consolidation of the economy. We can talk about the rescue plans as well, but today is more about segmentation. Because when we analyze the thing, we have the impression that we are dealing with all the EPE or small-sized companies in an equal balance. So we have to segment them, because we have very performant companies. Some companies are less performant than the others, and the decisions are not suitable. The same decisions are not suitable for all the companies. So today, So it rests with the state to create a clear ecosystem favorable and facilitating for the emergence of those companies, and also distant towards those small and medium-sized companies. We cannot dissociate the state from the daily management of these companies. And to come back to the role of board of directors, my contribution could be helpful, modestly, could contribute to the recommendations that could come out of this meeting. So I think that they should play a role in terms of improvement, and I'm not going to dwell into the details because time doesn't allow it. So I prepared a presentation, but I prefer to stick to the most important aspects. So we all agreed on the choice of profile, the purely disciplinary character of the administrators or directors who have heavy responsibility and who should also preserve the interest of the companies where they sit. We have also the control that we haven't spoken much about. The KPI, the necessary KPI to be able to evaluate the performance indicators, to challenge the managers. So the directors should also be endowed with this capacity and capability, and also to take adequate decisions. I have also noted that good governance of companies should go through strategic orientations. So we know that the strategic part is really important, and we have to have a strategy. And the role of directors is to support companies in the development of their strategic plans. It's really important, especially with the objectives that they have, the streamlining of expenditures, and also the mechanism of management to alleviate the public treasury in the search of solutions for investment. And I conclude by the public and private partnership. I think that this has been discussed today. So this should be done. So it won't be done by public companies alone or private companies alone, by a mix of two. So we will come back to these points later. You have raised important points. So
it will go without any problem. Thank you. Sorry for this disruption. أشرف تسمعني؟
أيوة سامع كويس. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
طيب I'm very sorry actually for this technical issue. يعني this is out of my hand. I'm sorry about this. I will try to be very brief now and focus on the key, like maybe 4 or 5 points where I thought يعني our brothers in Algeria can pay attention to, so that they don't like make the same mistakes that many countries have made around the globe. Now, the first issue that you have to look at and to think about is loyalty and fiduciary as well. Now, in one of the OECD recommendations or writings, they say that the SOE boards have to be charged with the duty to act in the interest of both the state and the companies. And that's one of the problems that you will face, because this is dual loyalty. So in companies, we say directors have to do the best for the company, But when you are a director in a state-owned company, then you have to do the best for the company, and then you have to do the best for the country as well. And these are not always, in fact, the same. So sometimes you do have issues there. So what will happen is in making some of the strategic discussions and decisions, such as major projects and investments, if you are a board member in a private company, you apply the economic standards and you will say yes or no. But when you are in a state-owned company, you have the interest of the state as well. And that's where sometimes you see conflicting decisions happening and lots of issues that come, because if somebody says to you it's the interest of Algeria or national interest for the country, you feel that you cannot really, go against that. The second thing which I'd like to draw your attention is the idea of independence. So the process of selecting or appointing boards of directors and the idea of independence there. In many cases, the state-owned enterprises boards are in fact appointed either by the state directly or by a minister or by a body controlled by the state. And that's why you find in many cases most of the board members in state-owned companies are themselves public employees. Okay, and if they are not, then they are very closely connected to the government or to the state in that respect. Now, what is the problem of this? There is no independence. So I remember one of the boards we dealt with, one of the companies in the biggest companies actually in the GCC. The head of the board was very close to the ruler of the country, and some of the board members were ministers as well. So you can't really expect these people to be independent in their mentality, and they have to follow directions there. Now, one of the things which one of the delegates talked about before, which is when you have workers on the boards of directors. Now, when you have employees on the boards, this becomes very political and very problematic. I mean, I've seen lots of problems in boards of state-owned companies because of employee representation, and they are like unionists more than really proper board members. Now, of course, one of the key elements is the free market mechanism. Now, we have seen a lot in different countries that SOEs can, in a major way, can damage market functioning in different ways. Now, sometimes we see that SOEs have preferential treatment from the banks, whether this is an official or informal, because banks feel it's more safe to give money to the state-owned companies. They are guaranteed by the state. So this creates crowding out from the private sector. So while you are trying to build the economy, you are in fact destroying the private sector by engaging in economic activities there. In many cases, we have seen state-owned companies which cannot go bankrupt. So they are immune against bankruptcy, for example, which means in this case that they can afford certain procedures and policies and pricing which the private sector cannot afford. Okay. Again, in many cases, we have seen state-owned companies that they are preferred suppliers for the government. So if the government is willing to get supplies, or the army would like to get supplies, they go for state-owned companies. So all these things, what will happen is if you are the board of directors of a company, how can you, one of your responsibilities is, as we talked about fairness before, how can you be fair? How can you make sure that you are not damaging the private sector? How can you make sure that you are doing the best interest of the consumers and not just for the company itself? So in this case, you might find yourself as a board member engaging in decisions which in the short term might be okay because you achieve the best for the government, but in the long term, you are in fact creating damage for the economy in this case. Now, the fourth thing, which is on the goals of companies and the supervision and accountability. Now, as you all know, and you mentioned this, state-owned companies, they do have different objectives. Some of them are economic, some of them are political, some of them are social and financial, and so on. Now, by default, most of these objectives are conflicting. They are not going hand in hand. And this will raise also the issue of the KPIs, which was mentioned before. How you assess the performance of the company. Now, how you assess the performance of the board of directors in this case. Now, when you have the regulators or you have the audit agency, they usually focus on the financials and the procedures. But you have other things that they're doing as well. They're compensated for that. So this is really a very important thing. Now, also one of the points which were mentioned before, it is key positions and top management. Now, do you have the choice as a board to dismiss the CEO of the company and top management? In many cases, you cannot. So while in fact you are responsible for the company and its performance, its management, you have some sort of tied hands in dealing with the management. You cannot do whatever you want to do. You have lots of issues you have to consider there. Now, I give you just 3 examples of dysfunctional boards we have seen in state-owned companies a lot actually in the region. The first one is the shareholder board. That's where you see shareholders are on the board. I've seen this in cases where state-owned companies or big investment funds come to establish a company. So you see the big shareholder, he is the chairman, and other small shareholders, either they are very small or they appoint representatives. In this case, this board cannot function because it acts like an AGM, a general assembly, not actually as a board of directors. The second one, which is very common in state-owned companies, is a trophy board. A lot of the directors there are there as reward for something else. Some of them are ex-ministers, some of them are ex-army people or police people, some of them even are seniors in companies, but as a type of compensation, they are placed on SOE board. So the government puts them there to give them more extra money. So in this case, they don't really, they are not really qualified, but they are there because of something else. And of course, we have seen the yes man or the rubber stamping board, as I explained in one of the companies we have seen before. Now, if the chairman of the board is very close to the ruler of the country, and then some of the board members are ministers and key officials, they cannot really say no to him because they understand that he can really affect their jobs in different places. So the last 2 slides I will talk about today, the first one is recommendations. I love the OECD recommendation of the rationale for ownership. You have to ask yourself, now we own, as somebody mentioned now, over 500 companies in Algeria. You have to ask yourself, for every single company, why do we have to own this company? Why does the state have to own that specific company? Now, why can't we do regulation and do privatization and allow the private sector to function there? It is globally confirmed that the private sector is much more dynamic. They are more focused, that they can manage companies better. So I need to ask myself, number one, why do I have to own this company? And number 2, if I have to own the company, I have to make sure that there is no exception for the company. It is run just like a private company. There is no preferential treatment for this company, whether in financing, in supplying, in whatever. It has to follow the same sort of rules, and there has to be competition in the market. Otherwise, you are stealing the private sector, even in good faith, if you like, in some cases. Okay. Now, the third one, which is again recommendation by the OECD, that's really important, which is you should not use the SOE for non-economic objective. Now, that's too ideal sometimes. So, for example, in the case of Algeria, the government might say, we need to create jobs in certain area for developing it. Now, if you do this, I have to calculate what is the cost of doing that. And the government has to take the cost, not the company. In some cases, we have seen the company is the one paying for all this cost. It's not supposed to be the company, it's supposed to be the government. And we have to understand how it's costing us. This is really quite important. And for all this, what we need to do is we have to establish some sort of auditing mechanism to make sure that these companies are not abusing the position in which they are. Sometimes they are monopolies, they are very powerful companies. How can we make sure that we are putting the right people on the boards of directors of these companies? This is quite important. if I can give a recommendation, I would say do not put any public officials or public employees on these boards. Make it really independent and strong board of directors. Now, the final slide I'll make today, number one is government should focus on regulation and enforcement and discipline and creating the right environment. And they allow the private sector to grow and compete and be healthy. So we should try to avoid competing with the private sector, but allowing the private sector to achieve objectives there. In exceptional cases, it has to be for a limited time. So if I have to own a company, I say I will own it for 3 years, or 2 years, or 5 years, and then khalas, I have to move it to the private sector. I cannot continue owning, because what will happen is eventually the performance will go down. It will create lots of problems for you. It's not really a good idea. Now, the final thing is the state-owned boards and directors are full of conflicts automatically because of all what I mentioned and you mentioned in your previous discussions. They are full of conflict. So at least let's make sure that we're putting the right people on the board. Now, some countries like India, for example, they created a system by which there is an agency which inspects people and recommends them on public board. Now, when I talk to people on the ground, they say it's not working. It's not really working well. So you have to think of what is the best way to make sure I am putting independent, qualified people on the board, and I can hold them accountable for whatever that they are doing. So now, please, before trying to expand the public sector and please make sure that you are putting the right systems in place to make sure that we are not destroying the economy today. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to answer any questions or any comments from you. Thank you, everyone.
Shukran, Ashraf. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would say some of them controversial recommendations that you are making. I'm sure that it will raise a number of issues and we will be discussing it. Est-ce qu'il y a des observations, des commentaires?
Any remarks, comments, maybe additional point of views in the room? I know it's been a long morning session. In the name of God, the Merciful, member of the National Council of Algerian Producers. We are a reality. We are the brothers of the public, the private and public hand in hand for the same objective as part of the president's instruction. So the last orientation that said that the private sector need to be always profitable. We have always positive balances in the country of the public sector, but that does not question the competence of the public sector. But we see that after the directors, managers of the public executives, they are absorbed into the private sector, and we see the competence and the profitability is that shows that the public directors and managers are competent, but they cannot work. They are hampered in their work because of the legislation in place. So the state also have to play the role of firemen to save the public company. So they need to make their balance positive. Also, the private sector is suffering, so the law texts, the constitution has is the same for the private and public companies. They are like brothers. So we're privileging the public in my sector, which is the public and the construction. And there's a huge competition for the private. Mrs. Please, can you remain in the core subject? I sum up to say that the private and public need to have a common vision, brotherly vision, in order to create employment and added value. Are there other comments? Hello, my name is Murad Louadah. I'm president of the National Commission of Renewable Energies at the RCGA, representative of the RCGA here. I've participated in this seminar in tribute of Mohamed Ben Khabza, and you made this speech at the time you were at the planification sector, and you said that we need to bring the public to the private, and maybe we did the opposite thing with wasting resources. Now the issue here, the law of 1988. With this law, things have changed totally at the level of socialist companies, and at that moment, I think we created a market. Our minister has talked about the duties and obligations. Today, if we take the model, how do you call it? We have three models: the market service, public service, and the industry. They separated these markets, and they really succeeded very well in Norway. So in 1999, they started having a sovereignty fund. They privatized all the public companies existed, and now they are at about 60%. So we need to have a clear strategy in terms of governance. It's very important to speak about the people, human resources, and ethics. I think we should liberalize and have economic actors and forget that the public enterprises only serve the public services. So these are recommendations. We are try to sum up, please, your thoughts, and try to remain in the core subject. So first of all, we needed to ask the top management, all the subventions, we need to leave them aside. We need to ask the top management to have a profitability so that the treasury helps the added value and not the consumption. Thank you. I think there's a lady who wants to take the floor. I wanted to... You already took the floor, but it's okay. I didn't know that we had a definite and limited number of interventions. I suspected that. because I raised my hand several times and you did not give me the floor. I didn't see you. Okay. So concerning the intervention of the Sir before, concerning the regulation authorities, you know, the regulation authorities, when they were set in the United States, they were aimed at stopping the private companies and the multinationals. So the regulation authorities are not here just to regulate the state. The state is here to regulate something else. So it has this regulation authority was created in order to protect the state from private companies. That's between brackets. Now, absolutely, that's how the regulation authority started at the beginning in the United States. And when we talk about the state intrusion, here we have the management in times of crises, and we have the intervention in times of stability when the state needs to not intervene. And but in times of crisis, it's different. So the state has this role of surveillance, of monitoring the public companies or companies that are created in partnership, private-public partnership, in order to ensure the security of national economy. We know the interventionism and movement and protectionist movement in many companies, and the good governance of companies has to keep in mind the national economy's interest. So I'm giving you the beforehand vision and the afterwards vision. Excuse me to interrupt you, but do you have questions to ask? So please, maybe we'll leave these elements for the end of our session. Do you have comments, precise questions to our speakers? I see a hand raised. Good morning. I'm Mr. Khafesh, consultant in companies management and director in an industrial group. So the theme of this meeting is the governance of public companies. I see in the room there are private partners as well. We've talked about the governance of Algerian companies. Me personally, as a director, I see that there's a lot of work to do at the level of companies. There's a lot of, the culture of governance that need to be changed at the level of our companies. I'm talking to the representatives of the CNES. I'm asking them to organize a meeting on the governance of Algerian companies, whether private or public, notably on the board of directors in the private and the public sectors. Thank you very much. I don't see other hands raised. I see a woman, a lady, please. Good morning. My name is Qadri Lila, CEO of the group GPEC. I would like to go back to the depenalization of the act of management, or decriminalization of the act of management, or mistakes in management. If there's a will to commit an offense like a theft, that could be described as a crime, but in our position, when managing, we take risks, and so in this case, it's a decriminalization of the fault of management. We have also what's related to the management of markets and the trade code. The trade code is applied generally, but sometimes it's not applied. If we're before a court judge, he asks us if we've applied the public market code. So if it's a case of cessation of payment for companies, and the company needs to be closed, we cannot take this decision at the level of the board because there are political challenges also. So thank you. I think there's another intervention. It will be the last one. Good morning. Thank you. My name is Sabiha Neitqasi from Sonatrach. I have a question related to directors. We have talked a lot this morning about the importance of their role and their responsibilities. We've insisted on the fact that the need of diversifying their profile. My question is, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of professionalizing the position of administrator? Thank you. I would like to ask this question to Ashraf if he's still online. I think he left. We'll discuss this. I think there are solutions. Last person to take the floor. Thank you, Mr. Bornan. Hello, everybody. I'm Hamda Abu Abdullah, former legal advisor at Sonatrach. I would like to go back on many points that were evoked. Briefly, please. First of all, the position of the first official of the public company. He is named by presidential decree. He is chosen from a panel of directors, while the presidential decree gives a description of this position as he is mandated by the first magistrate of the country. And he will be part of the board of directors as the other directors, and he is accountable for his acts, and he could even be prosecuted for his decisions. At Sonelgaz, the first official, CEO of Sonelgaz, if he doesn't take some decisions, he could be prosecuted for not taking these decisions. And he takes these decisions, he could be also a prosecutor. So this is the dilemma. So he got to guarantee that the entire country is connected with the power. So we have this problematic. Please, briefly, because we need to give the floor to the intervenants. So the board of directors, as it is, has to discuss the issues that are noted in the agenda of the day. So if there's a new point that is included in the agenda, it will be very limited. Also, the Code of Commerce or Trade Code do not distinguish between the public and private SPA or stakeholders company. So he has a number of regulations to apply, guidelines that need to be respected. So this difference, I know there's a difference between the private and the public sectors, but there's a need for an equitable management or treatment. If you allow me, maybe we'll go back to Mr. Hans. He has left. Dr. Bobby, do you have comments to make? Thank you very much. I would like
riche et nourrie.
Very briefly intervene. The discussion was very rich.
C'est deux choses. D'abord,
So,
les entreprises publiques, nous en avons besoin pour assurer l'équilibre, la cohésion, la solidarité de nos sociétés. Et donc, ce n'est pas un archaïsme, ce n'est pas des exceptions, nous en avons besoin. À condition, deuxième élément, qu'elles correspondent à leurs objectifs de cohésion, de solidarité dont je viens de parler, et que ça ne devienne pas des bureaucraties qui prennent le pas sur la vie de la société, sur la vie économique et sociale. Le marché n'a pas réponse à tout. Il faut qu'il soit complété, régulé, et les entreprises publiques ont un rôle, pas tous les rôles, un rôle à jouer dans cet esprit-là pour assurer la cohésion et l'équilibre. Voilà, je n'en dis pas plus, mais ça me semble important d'avoir un équilibre de nos visions, de nos démarches, et pas simplement d'avoir des visions unilatérales. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These are fundamental points. The non-discrimination between the partners and the complementarity between the operators is the key element for the success of the economic growth everywhere in the world, and we see where it works.
I think that he's been disconnected. He's not here anymore. I think that we come to the end of the first part of the first session. I won't make a summary. We will have the chance to come back to that during the debate. I would simply ask to concentrate and focus on this object, which is the role of a board of directors. I know that the subject is really broad, and it's the first time that we tackle the subject with openness and transparency. It will probably take us to other subjects and other aspects, but we cannot, unfortunately, tackle or dwell into. I can give you the example of Kenya and a certain other number of other countries where the directors in public companies are not chosen or appointed, but they embark in a bidding offer where criteria as set. There is another point which is also important. I speak under the control of the CEO of Sonelgaz. So the selection is made based on KPI and the risk indicators that have to be managed. Unfortunately, the risk aspect is not even managed by our banks. Thank you very much. So I would like to seize the opportunity to thank and greet my friend Bashir, with whom I was talking a couple of days ago. So Bashir will take over after the break. Thank you very much and see you later. So I'd like to thank everybody and thank the participants, especially Mr. Pierre, Ashraf and Hans, for their contribution and the presentations. They allowed a rich debate to take place and opened tracks for the future. Thank you.